The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like a ventilator that never quit. Rachel Torres had clocked in at 11:47 p.m., the same time she had for 92 consecutive nights, and nobody at St. Michael's Hospital in San Antonio had learned to look at her face yet. That was intentional. The temp badge clipped to her scrub said RN, temporary assignment, and the ER staff treated it like a scarlet letter. She moved through the corridors with the kind of invisibility that came from 3 months of keeping her head down, her hand steady, and her mouth shut. The night shift belonged to the forgotten nurses. The ones who restocked supplies at 2 in the morning, who answered call lights without complaint, who never asked for credit and never demanded recognition. Rachel was perfect at it. She had learned invisibility in a combat field hospital 17 years ago, where the difference between being noticed and being ignored could mean the difference between a mission and a failed extraction. Back then, she'd learned to move like the equipment moved, essential but unremarkable. Chlorinated air and sweat and the copper smell of blood had been her sensory baseline. Now it was antiseptic and cold stainless steel gleaming under harsh white light, and her body recognized the rhythm of crisis the same way a shark recognizes blood in water. She moved down the corridor toward the supply room, her combat boots silent on the tile despite their weight. The soles were worn to the leather in places, but they had been broken in on roads that didn't show up on any map. Her right shoulder blade held a scar from tickret that pulled when the humidity spiked, and her left hand bore 3 fingertip calluses from a surgical technique that shouldn't exist in civilian hospitals. But her hands looked ordinary enough, competent, steady, the kind of hands that belonged to a night shift temp nurse who had learned her trade in some forgettable community college program. The supply room was cool and organized, the kind of space that told you everything about a hospital's true financial picture. Rachel had worked at enough facilities to know the difference between a hospital that invested in its staff and one that nickeled and dimed every department. St. Michael's was somewhere in the middle, which made the inconsistencies stand out like shrapnel in fresh wound tissue. 3 shipments of premium vascular clamps marked as routine expendables. 40 units of endotracheal tubes logged under a different cost code than they should have been. Suture quantities that didn't match the OR discharge summaries. She had noticed these things the way a radiologist notices a shadow in the wrong place, not with alarm, but with the kind of professional certainty that comes from seeing the shape before. Rachel pulled the supply log toward her, the bound ledger's spine cracking softly. She cross-referenced the trauma bay inventory against the morning's procedure reports. The numbers didn't align, and they hadn't aligned for 6 weeks. A phantom procedure here. A kickback arrangement there. Nothing so flagrant that it would trigger an audit. Just enough to be profitable if you knew the system and had the access to move things around. She had seen this in Kandahar, where supply sergeants worked with local contractors. She had seen it in the staffing office at Bethesda, where overrun budgets disappeared into cost centers that didn't exist. She recognized the architecture of fraud the way other people recognized their own handwriting. The door to the supply room opened. Dr. Marcus Pierce stood in the doorway, his lab coat immaculate, his shoes polished to a shine that probably cost more than Rachel's monthly rent. He was 53, handsome in the way that money made handsome, and he moved through the hospital like he owned it. In a way, he did. As the ER director, he controlled staffing, budget allocation, and every operational decision that mattered. He also controlled something else, a network of relationships with medical suppliers that had made him wealthy enough to own a 6-bedroom colonial in the medical district and a boat that stayed docked at Canyon Lake most of the year. Burning the midnight oil. His voice carried the kind of ease that came from never being questioned. Rachel straightened, closing the ledger with a motion that was careful and unremarkable. Supply rotation. She kept her voice flat, deferential. Just a temp. Just background noise. Inventory reconciliation. Pierce smiled, and it didn't reach his eyes. You're thorough. I like that. We don't always get thorough on the night shift. He moved closer, and Rachel felt the air pressure in the room change the way it did before a storm. This wasn't a casual visit. He had come looking for something specific. How long have you been with us now? 3 months, Doctor. Right. And before that? His eyes tracked across the supply shelves, cataloging, assessing. travel nursing, contract positions. It was partially true. She had spent the last 18 months moving through military medical facilities under various covers, gathering intelligence on a witness who needed to recover quietly. The San Antonio assignment was supposed to be routine. Monitor Captain James Holloway, a Navy SEAL from the Special Warfare Command who had witnessed something in the Hindu Kush that made certain people at the Pentagon very nervous. Keep him safe. Gather intelligence. Don't let anyone know why she was really there. Pierce nodded slowly, still smiling. Well, temps are useful for short-term staffing gaps. Nothing permanent, of course. You understand how it works. We need flexibility, and you need hours. A fair trade. He turned to leave, then paused at the doorway. One thing though. The trauma bay is reserved for the senior staff. Rotating floats. If you could keep your charting and supply work focused on the general ward, that would be helpful. We like to keep things organized. Of course, Doctor. He left. Rachel stood motionless for 7 full seconds, listening to his footsteps fade down the corridor. The message had been delivered with surgical precision. Stay away from the trauma bay. Stay away from the high acuity cases. Stay away from anywhere she might actually see something. Stay away from where her real skills would become visible. She had been outmaneuvered. It took her a moment to recognize it because it had been so quiet. No confrontation. No raised voice. Just a polite instruction wrapped in institutional language. He knew she was paying attention to something. He didn't know what, exactly, but he knew a temp nurse shouldn't be this thorough with supply documentation. And now he was going to contain her? Isolate her. Keep her behind an invisible barrier. The shift continued. Rachel moved through the ward checking vitals, hanging antibiotics, changing dressings on routine post-op patients. The work was competent and invisible. Around 3:20 in the morning, the intercom crackled. Code blue. Trauma Bay 4. GSW entry, lateral thorax, ETA 8 minutes. Rachel heard it the way she heard everything, as information. She documented her current patient's vitals, handed off her task to another nurse, and moved toward the trauma bay like she was heading anywhere. The automatic doors slid open. Dr. Pierce was already there, consulting with the trauma team, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made people move faster. She stopped at the threshold. Trauma bays reserved, he said without turning. Stand by in the ICU. We'll call you if we need extra hands. She nodded and turned away. But the doors to the trauma bay opened then, and the paramedics came through with the stretcher. Male patient. Mid-30s. Blood-soaked gauze on his left chest. And his eyes, they were the color of the Atlantic in winter, and they found her face in the crowded bay and held there for one impossible second. She recognized him. Captain James Holloway, SEAL Team 3, Charlie Platoon. The reason she was at St. Michael's. The reason she had buried her rank and her medals and her real identity under 3 months of invisible competence. She could see the moment he recognized something in her too, not her face, but the way she stood. The way her eyes tracked his chest wound with the precision of someone who had assessed 1,000 of them. The recognition lasted less than 2 seconds before the trauma team surrounded him and he was wheeled deeper into the bay. Rachel turned back toward the corridor, and Pierce watched her go with satisfaction written across his face. He had just made his first move. He had no idea he had made his first mistake. Grand rounds at St. Michael's started at 7 in the morning, and Dr. Pierce always arrived early to set the stage. Rachel watched him arrange himself at the head of the conference table like a general surveying conquered territory, his white coat pressed with military precision, his silver cufflinks catching the overhead lights. 23 residents filtered in with their notebooks and their hierarchies, and Rachel stood at the back near the medication cart, just where a temp nurse belonged, invisible, useful, forgotten. She had learned invisibility the way soldiers learn breathing. It kept her alive. Pierce's voice cut through the morning like a scalpel finding flesh. "We have a significant patient safety issue to address today," he announced, his eyes already fixed on Rachel with the precision of a hunter marking prey. Last Thursday evening, a charting error nearly compromised a Level 1 trauma case. Incomplete medication documentation. Sloppy initials. The kind of negligence that gets people killed. Rachel had charted that case with the precision she'd learned in forward operating bases where mistakes meant body bags. 12 minutes, every detail documented, every medication signed off in triplicate. But she didn't move. Didn't blink. Just stood there listening to lies being fashioned into evidence. "The error originated from our temporary nursing staff," Pierce continued, turning to face the assembled residents. He pointed directly at Rachel. "This is exactly why we maintain strict protocols about who handles our critical patients. Standards exist for a reason, people. Not everyone has the discipline, or the intelligence, to follow them." A resident snickered. Then another. The sound rippled through the group like contagion, small cruel echoes of permission. "Miss Torres," Pierce said, and his voice had dropped to something almost conversational, almost friendly, which made it infinitely more vicious. "Perhaps next time you could manage to document medications where the physicians can actually read them? Or is penmanship another casualty of the temporary workforce?" Rachel took one measured breath. The kind of breath that had steadied her hands while performing open cardiac massage on a 17-year-old kid in Tikrit with mortars falling 3 blocks away. She felt the tear come, just one, escaping before her brain could stop it, but her hand was already there, wiping it away with the back of her wrist before anyone could see the wetness. Her eyes met Pierce's. Flat. Unbroken. Waiting. "I've held intestines in my hands while mortars fell, doctor," she said quietly. Every word measured like ammunition. "Your performance review doesn't shake me." The room went absolutely silent. No one moved. No one breathed. Pierce's face darkened, and Rachel saw something flicker across his expression, not quite fear, but something close to it. A recognition that he had just struck at someone whose scars ran deeper than institutional authority could reach. "Well," he said finally, his voice sharp with recovered confidence. "That kind of attitude is exactly why we need to maintain professional distance from temporary staff. Residents, take note." He turned back to his charts as though she had already ceased to exist. But she had seen his hand shake slightly as he reached for his coffee. She had seen the calculation begin behind his eyes. The vending machine incident came the next evening, 9:06 p.m., during the skeleton shift when only a handful of nurses and physicians occupied St. Michael's. Rachel was standing in the break room, feeding dollar bills into the machine, when Pierce entered with a resident trailing behind him like a remora following a shark. He didn't acknowledge her at first, just talked to the resident while pointing at Rachel with a tone that managed to be simultaneously dismissive and cruel. "You see how the temporary staff interacts with equipment? No respect for protocol," he said. "No sense of investment in maintaining standards. Last month she contaminated a whole supply line because she couldn't be bothered to follow decontamination procedures." Rachel hadn't contaminated anything. She had actually prevented a contamination by flagging a damaged seal on an 4 line that the permanent staff had missed. "Maybe we shouldn't let her work in critical areas anymore," the resident offered, testing the waters, looking for permission to join Pierce's game. "I'm already considering it," Pierce said smoothly. He turned to Rachel directly now, his eyes glittering with something that looked like satisfaction. "Tell me, where exactly did you work before this? Your resume was remarkably sparse. Almost like you were hiding something." Rachel selected her snack, chocolate, protein-based, designed to burn slowly, and watched it tumble down. She didn't answer. Not because she couldn't. Because she wouldn't give him the satisfaction of engagement. She had learned interrogation resistance in 2011 as part of her commission training. She had learned that silence was the only response that couldn't be used against you. The strong, silent type, Pierce continued, his voice slipping into something more vicious. "That's fine. Security will help you pack your things if you can't comply with basic requirements. Or you could just find work somewhere else." Somewhere without standards. She looked at him then. Really looked at him. And in that moment, his entire future hung in the balance, though he had no idea. He saw what he expected to see, a frightened temp, a woman backing down, a problem being solved with intimidation. He didn't see the captain. He didn't see the operator. He didn't see the hands that had performed 18 life-saving surgeries in a 72-hour siege. The security threat was empty, and they both knew it. Labor laws protected temporary staff from casual termination. But he was laying groundwork. Documenting a pattern. Building a case for a termination that would look professional, justified, routine. That night, when Rachel assisted on the GSW repair, the patient, a Navy SEAL named James Holloway, had taken a round through the left anterior shoulder, the kind of wound that could take out muscle, bone, or vessels depending on trajectory. The surgery was scheduled for 2:13 a.m., which meant Dr. Pierce was on call but not in the room. The attending was Dr. Reeves, a competent trauma surgeon with 23 years of experience and no loyalty to Pierce's empire. Rachel's hands moved the way they always did during surgery, with absolute precision, with the muscle memory of someone who had done this under circumstances infinitely more difficult. She set up the tray with a 3-finger vascular clamp technique, the one she had developed during her trauma rotation at Camp Leatherneck, a method that applied maximum pressure with minimum tissue damage, something you only learned when you were working with 30 patients in a tent with inadequate supplies and the constant threat of incoming. The surgery was almost over, Holloway's bleeding controlled, his vessels intact, his survival probability climbing from critical into survivable, when his eyes opened. Most patients under surgical anesthesia remained paralyzed, unconscious, locked in a dreamless void. But James Holloway opened his eyes and looked directly at Rachel's face, and what happened next took less than 4 seconds. He stared at her hands. At the clamp. At the technique. And he whispered something that sounded like a prayer but wasn't. "Tikrit," he breathed. "You were the medic in Tikrit. 3rd Battalion. The angel." Rachel kept working, kept her voice level, kept her face absolutely professional. "Stay still," she said quietly. "Nearly done." "You were there," Holloway insisted, his voice thick with anesthesia and recognition. "I remember. I remember." Dr. Reeves didn't hear it over the monitor beeping and the suction running. Rachel continued stitching with the precision of someone whose neural pathways had been carved by combat medicine. But Holloway stayed conscious just long enough to stare at her, his recognition absolute, his betrayal of her cover complete before the anesthesia pulled him back under. It took Dr. Pierce exactly 6 minutes to review the surgical recording on his office tablet. He had installed surveillance cameras in every OR under the guise of training oversight, and he watched the video on 2:19 a.m., his bourbon growing warm in its glass as realization began to bloom across his face. He watched Rachel's hands move with a precision that no temporary agency nurse possessed. He watched her respond to Holloway with the kind of intimate knowledge of battlefield medicine that came from actual combat. He watched her whisper something back that the audio couldn't quite capture, but her lips formed the word clearly: stable. "Not you're stable, Mr. Holloway. Not vitals are stable." Just the word, pure and clinical and absolute, the word a medic spoke to a wounded soldier in the moment between crisis and survival. Pierce's hand tightened on his glass. The ice inside it crackled like breaking bones. He was no longer looking at an incompetent temp nurse with a bad attitude. He was looking at a trained operator, someone with combat experience, someone who knew too much about his billing operation, someone who had been placed here deliberately, for a purpose he didn't yet understand. His fingers moved across his phone with the calculated precision of a man who had spent 7 years building a financial empire and had no intention of watching it collapse. He opened his contacts and began to compose messages. To HR about reckless endangerment. To his contact at the Texas Board of Nursing about scope violations. To hospital administration about immediate termination procedures. He was still typing at 3:22 a.m. when the first message sent, his strategy already shifting from intimidation into something far more calculated, far more dangerous. He was going to remove her before she could destroy him. And he was going to do it with enough institutional weight behind it that no one would ask questions. What he didn't know, what no one knew except the few people in the Pentagon with security clearance to know it, was that Rachel Torres wasn't just a medic. She was a captain in the Naval Medical Corps. She wasn't there to steal her paycheck. She was there to protect James Holloway from the exact kind of person Pierce had proven himself to be. She had already made 43 phone calls to her handler documenting the kickback scheme. And her entire cover was about to detonate into the brightest light Dr. Pierce had ever seen. The San Antonio River swelled like a living thing, churning brown and violent against the retaining wall. 3 blocks from St. Michael's, the water crested the bank at 2:56 a.m. and poured into the basement levels with the force of a ruptured artery. The hospital's lower-level entrance flooded in minutes. The emergency backup generators screamed and died. The basement storage room, where pediatric supplies, blood products, and old equipment lay dormant, became a drowning chamber. Rachel heard the alarm first. Not the flood alarm. The ventilator alarm from the pediatric ward upstairs had triggered a cascade failure. She was in the break room, cold coffee in one hand, the folded flag from her fallen teammate pressed against her ribs in the other like a heartbeat she carried instead of her own. The building shuddered. Lights flickered. Then the radio crackled with panic. All personnel, we have water intrusion in B2. Repeat, water in basement level 2. Seal the doors. But nobody had sealed the doors. Rachel moved before anyone gave an order. Her legs knew the hospital's layout better than her conscious mind did. 18 years of combat medicine meant her reflexes operated on a frequency that didn't require thinking. She descended the stairwell in the dark because the backup lights had failed, moving by memory and muscle, her hand trailing the concrete wall. The smell hit first, not water, but the smell of wet electrical systems burning, ozone and copper and something underneath that smelled like rust and old blood. The basement corridor was already half submerged. Water sloshed against the walls, climbing. 20 inches. Maybe 22. The storage room door at the end of the hallway hung open like a mouth. Inside, 2 nurses screamed and a child didn't. The water was chest-high on the nurses. The pediatric patient, maybe 8 years old, was already slack-jawed and silent, pressed against Nurse Catherine's shoulder. Catherine was a good RN, competent, but competence meant nothing when the water kept rising and the exits were blocked and nobody had trained for this. The other nurse, Derek, was looking for a window that didn't exist, fingers scrabbling against cinder block. "Get to high ground," Rachel said. It wasn't a request. It was a command, and something in her voice, a frequency that had once ordered men through fire, made both nurses stop moving. "We can't leave her," Catherine said. "We're not. Move to the shelves. Now." Rachel entered the water. Cold. The temperature registered at her spinal cord and kept moving. Hypothermia would be a problem if they didn't solve the bigger problem first, which was that the child, a girl, Rachel could see that now, maybe 7 or 8, dark eyes already glassy, was drowning in slow motion while everyone watched. The girl's lungs weren't moving. No rise. No fall. Just that terrible flatness that Rachel had seen 18 times in Tikrit, in the basement of a bombed-out clinic, while mortars fell like rain and she'd held intestines in her hands and breathed life into soldiers who came back wrong or not at all. Triage protocol, Rachel said, more to herself than the nurses. "Get the girl to the supply room. Second shelf. I need everything with surgical in the name." "What are you going to do?" Catherine's voice cracked. Rachel was already moving, water up to her ribs now, the cold so sharp it felt like being stabbed. She had maybe 4 minutes before the girl's neurons started dying. For minutes before irreversible brain damage. For minutes before a 7-year-old became a 7-year-old who couldn't remember her mother's name. They got the girl to the supply room. Derek, at least, understood what was happening. He'd worked long enough to recognize the shift in Rachel's bearing, the way her movements became precise and economical, the way her voice dropped an octave and stopped apologizing. He moved without hesitation, carrying the child to the highest shelf, laying her flat on her back with her head tilted backward. Rachel found the scalpel. Not ideal. A supply room scalpel used for opening boxes, but a blade was a blade, and her hands had performed surgery with less. The water kept rising. 26 inches now. The smell of fierce wet mixing with that metallic ozone smell. Catherine was praying, actually praying, her lips moving in Spanish. "I need light," Rachel said. Derek aimed his phone at the child's throat. The beam was weak and yellow, but enough to see the cricoid cartilage, the space between the rings where she needed to go. 1 inch. That was all the space she needed. 1 inch to access an airway that wasn't blocked, to bypass the lungs that weren't working, to give this girl's blood the oxygen it was screaming for. "What are you doing?" Catherine asked. "Emergency cricothyrotomy," Rachel said quietly. "Hold her steady." The scalpel went in clean. A vertical line, 3 centimeters, right through the skin and the cricothyroid membrane. The sound was small and terrible. The hiss of air escaping. That was her signal. The girl's lungs wanted to work. They just needed a pathway. Rachel's hands moved on their own. Muscle memory took over. She used the scalpel's handle as a retractor, and then her own fingers, her left hand became a separator, holding the wound open while her right hand worked. This was the part they didn't teach in nursing school. This was the part she'd learned in a clinic in Tikrit where there weren't enough hands and too many dying. "Breathing tube," she said. Derek was already moving, already understanding, already finding a 4.0 pediatric endotracheal tube in the medical supply cabinet. He handed it to her like a sacrament. The tube went in. Rachel felt its seat, felt the slight resistance, felt the exact moment when the anatomy aligned. She taped it to the girl's face with supplies from the cabinet, her movements economical and certain. "Okay," she said. "Okay. Breathe." The girl's ribs rose. Once. Twice. The rise and fall of a body remembering how to live. "O2 saturation?" Rachel said. Derek had grabbed a pulse ox from somewhere, or maybe it was still attached to an old monitor in the corner. He clipped it to the girl's finger. The number climbed. 68, 72. 79, the steady beep of the monitor accelerating like a heartbeat learning to remember. 82, 86. 88. "She's coming back," Catherine whispered. Rachel didn't respond. She was already thinking 3 steps ahead, which was the only way to survive in this kind of space. The water had risen to 31 inches. The shelves wouldn't protect them much longer. The exit was a corridor filled with water. The stairwell they'd come down was sealed from the other side, a mechanical lock that responded to the flood sensors. "There," Catherine said, and Rachel saw what she meant. A maintenance access panel. High up, near the ceiling. Old. Probably led to the basement of the adjacent building. Probably hadn't been opened since Clinton was president. But it was an out. "Derek, I need you to get that door open. Find a crowbar, a hammer, anything." "What about?" Catherine gestured at the girl. "I've got her," Rachel said. "But we need to move. The water's still rising. We have maybe 2 minutes before this room becomes a tomb." Derek found a crowbar. It took him 47 seconds to pry the panel open. 47 seconds of scraping metal and water sloshing and the girl's breathing growing stronger. Rachel kept her hand on the girl's chest, feeling the ribs rise, the lungs working, the small heart finding its rhythm again. 92, 93. "Stable. Go," Rachel said. Catherine went first, climbing through the panel, Derek helping push her through. Then Rachel handed Derek the girl, still taped to the temporary airway, still breathing the gift of stale basement air. They passed her through like she was made of crystal. Rachel was the last one through, pulling herself up by her arms while the water rose below her and the room filled behind her like a mouth closing. She felt Derek grab her wrist and pull. Cold. Everything was so cold. But cold meant alive. They emerged in the adjacent building's basement, all of them shaking, all of them soaked. The girl was breathing. Still breathing. Her eyes were moving under her lids, that REM movement that meant her brain was still firing, still working, still choosing to live. "We need to get upstairs," Rachel said. "We need to get her to CT. I need imaging on those lungs, a crash cart, someone with pediatric intubation experience who isn't me." Catherine was staring at Rachel like she'd never seen her before. "Who? What are you?" Rachel didn't answer. She was already moving, already carrying the girl toward the stairs, already thinking about oxygen saturation and the fact that a field thoracotomy on a child was supposed to be last resort emergency medicine, not something you did in a basement with a box cutter scalpel. And she was thinking about Dr. Pierce, somewhere upstairs, watching the security footage of the lower level on his hospital-issued tablet, watching the footage that his IT contact had flagged as unusual activity. Watching the moment when a temp nurse with a surgical technique that nobody on staff possessed had just performed emergency thoracic surgery with her own hands as retractors. Watching the moment when his entire operation stopped mattering because the woman he'd tried to destroy had just saved a child's life, and the security cameras, all of them, high definition and timestamp verified, had recorded every second. The water kept rising in the room they'd left behind, filling the space where the girl had nearly drowned, creating a perfect seal. But it was too late to seal anything now. The evidence was floating upstairs in a temporary nurse's hands, alive and breathing and about to change everything. Rachel reached the first-floor stairwell with the girl still cradled against her chest, still breathing, still alive, and every single person who saw them step out of that darkness would remember the look in her eyes. Not the eyes of a temp nurse. The eyes of someone who'd held intestines in her hands while mortars fell and never flinched. The eyes of someone who'd made a choice to stay visible, stay present, stay in a hospital where a doctor was trying to destroy her, because sometimes the mission isn't about staying hidden anymore. Sometimes the mission is about standing in the light and letting everyone finally see who's been saving lives all along. The water streamed from her uniform as she emerged into the basement stairwell, the child gasping his first real breath against her shoulder, small ribs expanding like a second chance. The monitors upstairs would confirm it, the O2 sat climbing, the heart rhythm steady, the impossible made possible through muscle memory and hands that refused to accept drowning as an ending. She moved through the corridors in that strange quiet that follows a save, the kind of silence where people don't know whether to celebrate or step back. Her badge still hung around her neck. For now. Security footage played back in Dr. Pierce's office on a loop, the monitor's glow casting his face in shades of clinical blue. He watched the moment her hands moved without hesitation, the supply room scalpel cutting through the pediatric patient's chest wall with the precision of someone who'd done this in rubble and darkness. He watched the way she positioned her fingers as retractors, opening the thoracic cavity with the muscle memory of someone who'd saved soldiers in Tikrit while mortars fell outside the surgical tent. There was no tremor in her hands. There was no doubt. There was only a captain doing what captains do when civilians are drowning. Dr. Pierce's jaw tightened. He reached for his desk phone at 4:17 p.m., his finger already pressing the extension for HR before the child's parents had finished thanking her. His voice carried the smooth cadence of a man who'd rehearsed this moment, who understood that bureaucracy moved faster than truth. "I need to report a critical breach of hospital protocol," he said into the receiver. "Reckless endangerment of a pediatric patient. Unauthorized medical procedure in a non-sterile environment." The temporary staff member in question has shown a pattern of operating outside her scope of practice. He paused, letting that settle. "I'm concerned about liability. I'm concerned about patient safety. I'm concerned about what else she's been doing unsupervised." The second call went to a contact at the Texas Board of Nursing at 4:23 p.m., a woman who'd signed off on his last 3 continuing education workshops, funded by kickback arrangements with the medical supply company that kept his department overstocked and his personal accounts well padded. "There's a temp nurse here who's been making independent surgical decisions," he told her. "Field procedures. Combat medicine techniques. The kind of thing that gets people hurt." He let the implication hang. "Just flagging it for your records." The third call to hospital administration came at 4:31 p.m. "Immediate termination recommended before she escalates further," he said. His voice sounded concerned, protective, like a man trying to prevent a disaster. "I suspect there are deeper issues at play. I'd recommend securing her access before the end of shift. For everyone's safety." Rachel didn't see it coming because she wasn't looking for it. She was still running on the adrenaline of a save, still riding that particular high that comes from hearing the word stable and knowing you put it there. She was walking toward her locker to change out of the damp scrubs clinging to her skin like a second nightmare when security appeared, not threatening, just present. They weren't supposed to look sympathetic. "Your badge has been deactivated," the senior guard said. His name was Martinez. He'd always nodded when she passed. "We're instructed to escort you from the building effective immediately." She didn't ask why. The question would require a conversation that would require answers she couldn't give without burning the whole operation. She didn't ask about the child. She didn't ask about the investigation that hadn't even started yet. She simply nodded, a movement so small it was barely visible, and turned back toward the elevator. The locker held her civilian jacket, her car keys, and the thing she never should have brought into this hospital, the folded flag from her last tour, from the medic named Santiago who'd taken shrapnel meant for her in Helmand province. She'd kept it in the locker's back corner, behind the standard-issue compression socks, behind the protocol's manual nobody read. She touched the triangle of heavy fabric, the way the folds held their creases from the Arlington ceremony 3 years ago, and felt something inside her chest that resembled the moment before a bomb detonates. She was home by 6:13 p.m., still in damp scrubs because changing required energy she didn't possess. The kitchen table had become her launch point for so many mornings, mission briefings disguised as nurse shift schedules, handler check-ins disguised as routine texts, a life constructed of lies so carefully stacked they'd begun to feel like architecture. Now she sat there as the afternoon light turned amber and then gray, her hands wrapped around a coffee gone cold, staring at the folded flag she'd placed on the table like an accusation. 10 years of operations. 43 assignments. 2 countries. 1 identity that was supposed to stay contained, compartmentalized, impossible to breach. And she'd blown it open like a field thoracotomy on a drowning child, cutting away the careful boundaries between Captain Rachel Torres and Rachel the temporary nurse, between the operative and the person, and now both of them were drowning. The door opened at 6:52 p.m., and her son Michael stood in the entryway with his backpack still slung across his chest, his 12-year-old face registering the shift in atmospheric pressure that children feel before adults do. His mother was home early. His mother was crying. His mother was still wearing the scrubs from this morning. "Why are you home?" His voice was small, the way it got when he was trying to solve a problem that didn't make sense. "Did someone call? Is someone not okay?" She couldn't tell him that she'd been terminated for saving a child's life. She couldn't tell him that she'd been placed at St. Michael's by Naval Intelligence to monitor a SEAL patient who was recovering from combat exposure and potential witness to war crimes. She couldn't tell him that her presence at that hospital was a classified operation that had just collapsed into the kind of silence that precedes either court-martial or worse. She couldn't tell him any of it without destroying the mission, without destroying the reason she'd been willing to work night shifts in a hospital while her son slept with a babysitter, without destroying the thing that had kept her alive through 12 years of service. So instead she pulled him close, this small person made of her genetics and her mistakes, and she didn't cry. Her eyes burned. But soldiers don't cry. Not in front of civilians. Not in front of the people they're supposed to protect. "People still need you," Michael said into her shoulder, a statement of such absolute conviction that it broke something in her she'd been holding together since the floodwaters retreated. "You don't stop helping people just because you're home. You help people. That's what you do." She held him and didn't speak. The folded flag sat on the kitchen table like a monument to all the identities she'd ever inhabited, all the people she'd saved at the cost of being no one at all. And somewhere across San Antonio, Dr. Pierce was already congratulating himself on a clean operation, unaware that the security footage had been archived, unaware that the billing records were about to become very important, unaware that his 3 phone calls had just triggered a chain of events that would end his career and restore hers. The rain started falling at 7:38 p.m., soft at first, then with the persistence of something determined. In the darkness outside their house, a car pulled up at the curb and parked. Then another. Then a black SUV with government plates, engine running, waiting. Michael fell asleep against his mother's shoulder while the storm gathered itself into something audible. And Rachel Torres sat motionless in the kitchen, holding the folded flag, and waited for the sound that was coming, the distant thump of helicopter rotors growing closer, growing louder, the sound of a military operation mobilizing to recover one of its own from the place she'd been trying to hide. The helicopter descended through rain that hammered the landing pad like buckshot. Rotors pushed the storm sideways. The sound filled St. Michael's the way a held breath fills a room, thick, urgent, impossible to ignore. Inside the hospital, in a third-floor conference room, the board members stopped mid-sentence. Fluorescent lights flickered. One of them glanced toward the window. Rachel Torres sat alone at the head of the table in civilian clothes, dark slacks, simple blouse, hair pulled back, her hands folded on a manila folder containing Dr. Pierce's formal complaint. 12 hours since her badge was deactivated. 12 hours since she'd carried a child back from drowning, and the hospital's response was a termination letter slipped under her apartment door by 6 a.m. The board was assembled to rubber stamp it. Standard procedure for reckless endangerment. A lawsuit waiting to happen, they said. Liability, they said. She'd performed an emergency surgical procedure without authorization, without proper instruments, without supervision. Protocol violation on every level. The board chairman, a man named Westbrook with a silk tie and the bearing of someone who'd never saved a life with his own hands, kept tapping his pen. Dr. Pierce sat 3 chairs to his right, his expression the color of satisfaction. He'd made his calls. He'd covered his tracks. The billing discrepancies were still buried in 847 separate transactions across 34 months. Nobody looked that hard unless someone told them to look. And now the person who might have told them would be gone by 2 p.m. Rachel hadn't spoken in the 40 minutes since the meeting began. She'd listened to the charges. Unauthorized procedure. Reckless endangerment of a minor. Breach of scope of practice. Fabricated charting error, this last one courtesy of Dr. Pierce's own handwriting, smoothly inserted into the pediatric trauma file to give the board one more reason to terminate fast and quiet. She'd absorbed each accusation the way she'd absorbed every insult in the supply closet, the grand rounds humiliation, the vending machine threat. One measured breath. One blink. Then stillness. The door opened. Michael Torres, age 12, stood in the doorway wearing his school uniform and carrying a shadow box. His mother's shadow box. The room's air pressure changed, not a sound, not a word, but something shifted. Westbrook's pen stopped mid-tap. "Mom," Michael said. His voice was small and clear and louder than anything in that room had been. "They need to see these." He walked forward and placed the shadow box on the table. The glass caught the fluorescent light. 3 medals lay in precise formation against white silk. A Navy Cross. A Bronze Star with 1 combat V. 2 Purple Hearts, stacked diagonal. Rachel's eyes closed for exactly 1 second. Then they opened. She didn't move. She didn't reach for her son. She simply looked at the box as if it contained someone else's life, which, in a way, it did. The life she'd left on a runway in Tikrit. The life that belonged to the person she'd stopped being 3 months ago when Naval Intelligence planted her in this hospital to guard a man named James Holloway. The door opened again. The wheelchair came through, motorized, smooth, pushed by the SEAL himself in hospital scrubs and a Marine Corps sweatshirt. His shoulder was still wrapped, still healing, but his eyes were sharp as a surgical lens. He wheeled to the center of the table and looked directly at Dr. Pierce. Then he turned to Rachel and whispered one word. "Valkyrie." The room went so quiet you could hear the rain outside. Westbrook's face had gone pale. One of the board members stood, a reflexive motion, unconscious, the kind of thing people did when a superior officer entered their vicinity, even in civilian clothes. The door opened a third time. A Marine Corps general in dress uniform filled the doorway. His ribbons ran the full width of his chest. His bearing was the kind that made you understand instantly why doors got opened and decisions got reversed. He carried a leather portfolio. He didn't ask permission to enter. "Captain Rachel Torres," he said, his voice like a tank idling in an underground garage. "Demonstrated extraordinary valor under fire in Tikrit. 18 life-saving surgeries conducted during a 72-hour siege." He paused. The citation continued. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Refusing evacuation until every wounded soldier under her command received treatment. Sustaining 3 separate injuries during combat operations, returning to duty each time. Her service exemplifies the highest standard of military medicine and combat leadership. He lowered the citation. His eyes moved to the medals on the table. These decorations represent something that board members in this room have never had to understand. The difference between living and dying isn't policy. It isn't authorization. It's the person standing across from you who knows what they're doing. Dr. Pierce's jaw tightened. His color rose from pale to something closer to arterial red. He straightened in his chair, that small movement of a man preparing to speak, to interrupt, to reassert his authority in his own hospital. The general's hand lifted, and a Pentagon liaison stepped forward. She was holding a phone. She pressed the speaker button. A voice came through the line. Male. Clipped. Military-grade precision. "This is Deputy Director Hayes, Department of Defense, Counterintelligence Operations. Captain Rachel Torres is a field operative under my direct command, placed at St. Michael's Hospital to maintain protective custody of a material witness to potential war crimes. Her medical credentials are legitimate. Her rank is Captain, United States Navy Medical Corps. Her operational codename is known to 6 individuals within the Department of Defense. One of them is me. Captain, your mission status." Rachel met the phone's microphone directly. "Mission complete, sir. Witness is stable. Hospital contamination identified and contained." The liaison disconnected. She turned to Dr. Pierce with a federal smile. "Doctor, we also have IT." The hospital's information technology director stood from the corner, a man named Crawford, early 60s, wearing a veteran's polo shirt with the 75th Ranger Regiment insignia on the chest. He carried a laptop. He opened it to a timeline of security footage, compressed, catalogued, time-stamped. He turned the screen toward the board. "I received an order this morning to delete all surveillance from the basement flood incident and the subsequent emergency board meeting." The order came from Dr. Pierce through hospital administration. "I'm a Navy veteran. Been in the IT department here for 14 years. I recognized a cover-up order when I saw one." Crawford clicked. Images appeared. Time codes. Dr. Pierce's hands on a terminal. Dr. Pierce's voice, recorded on the facility's audio system, making 3 separate calls. To the nursing board. To hospital legal. To a contact he called Marcus at a medical supplier office. Click. More images. Supply invoices. Billing records. Phantom procedures spanning 847 transactions worth $2.3 million. I preserved every frame. Every call. Every document. The federal agents entered then, 2 of them, badges already visible. The sound was boots on tile. Deliberate. Measured. The same rhythm that had carried Rachel through 17 different hospitals across 5 countries. One of the agents read Dr. Pierce's rights while the other placed handcuffs that clicked once, twice, final. They took him from the room while his chair scraped tile and nobody said anything. The general looked at Rachel. He saluted, his hand crisped to his temple, and held it there while he looked directly at the medals in the shadow box. Then he turned to Westbrook. "St. Michael's is under federal investigation for healthcare fraud. Captain Torres will be on paid administrative leave pending completion of that investigation. She will retain her position and clearance. And if anyone in this room has a problem with that arrangement, you can discuss it with my office." He didn't leave a pause for questions. "We're done here." The board members filed out slowly, carefully, like people leaving a cathedral they'd accidentally desecrated. The SEAL wheeled forward and squeezed Rachel's shoulder. Michael watched his mother stand and finally reach for the shadow box. She held it against her chest the way you hold something that's still breathing. 6 months passed like pages turning. Dr. Pierce stood in the break room of a strip mall urgent care center in San Antonio, wearing a name tag that read Steve. He was certified to teach CPR to teenagers who didn't know his real name, his credentials, or his price tag in a federal indictment. Minimum wage. 60 hours a week. The kind of shift work that kept him poor and visible and exactly where the court had decided he belonged. When anyone called him doctor by accident, something fractured behind his eyes. Rachel stood in dress whites at the Pentagon. The uniform was immaculate, pressed, crisp, the kind of uniform you wear when you're finally allowed to wear it in front of witnesses. Her son stood beside her. The folded flag from her fallen teammate, the one she'd kept in her locker, the only piece of her real life she'd let herself carry, was placed in a position of honor behind her as she accepted command of the Navy's new Medical Intelligence Division. A new department. 47 personnel. A charter specifically designed to place combat medics inside hospitals, to monitor witness safety, to identify fraud, to bridge the gap between military medicine and civilian healthcare. The general held her commission while she took the oath. She didn't tremble. She didn't hesitate. She simply spoke the words like someone speaking the truth. When it was over, Michael stood and applauded while enlisted personnel in the audience came to their feet. Back at St. Michael's, the board had announced reforms. A new compliance committee. An ethics hotline. A partnership with the VA to provide pro bono trauma care to veterans, something Rachel had insisted on before she accepted anything. She'd been offered the position of Chief of Trauma Medicine. She'd turned it down. Instead, she showed up 3 mornings a week in scrubs, moving through the ER with the authority of someone who'd earned it under fire. She checked vitals on patients who had no idea she outranked everyone in the building. She wrote orders that people jumped to follow. She looked at young residents with the same quiet dignity that had kept her alive when everything was trying to kill her. Sometimes in the break room, younger nurses asked about her. About how she could stay so calm. About what she'd done before she was a nurse. She'd smile, a small thing, barely visible, and tell them the same thing she'd learned in Tikrit, the trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. One of the ER nurses started leaving coffee on her station. Black, no sugar. Right at shift change. One of the resident physicians asked her to supervise his trauma protocols. The attending surgeon from the flood day introduced her to his wife at a hospital fundraiser, and Rachel met her eyes and said, "Your husband kept his hands steady when mine were full." That matters. Scars tell stories. Not the ones you see. The ones that change how you move through the world. On her last day before permanent assignment to the Pentagon, she returned to the supply room where she'd performed an emergency thoracotomy in the dark. The room had been cleaned. Everything was reorganized, new protocols posted, safety measures installed. She stood in the doorway and simply looked, not at the tools, but at the space between them. At the geometry of survival. Then she turned and went back to work, back to the patients who still needed her, back to the job that had hidden her and then revealed her and then given her exactly what she'd been looking for all along, not recognition, but purpose. Michael was waiting in the ER lobby when her shift ended. He was carrying a coffee that was definitely not hospital issue, something from their favorite place in San Antonio, the one with the old oak trees out front. He handed it to her without a word. She took it. Their eyes met, and something passed between them that didn't need translation. He'd held her medals. He'd brought them to that room. And she'd seen him understand, finally, that his mother had never been just a nurse. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" he asked. for knowing what I needed you to be." He smiled the way young men smile when they're proud of someone they love, and they walked out together into San Antonio afternoon, the coffee warming her hands, the uniform still pressed sharp underneath her civilian coat, waiting for a life that finally knew her name. Subscribe if you believe the quietest person in your workplace might just be saving lives when you're not watching. Like if you think hospitals need more warriors in scrubs. And comment, what would you have done if you'd watched your mother get fired for saving a child?